Section 12 of Thoughts on Art and Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Gramour. Thoughts on Art and Life by Leonardo da Vinci. Translated by Maurice Baring and edited by Lewis Einstein. Thoughts on Art, Part 7. How to represent night. That which is entirely devoid of light is all darkness. As the night is like this, and you wish to represent a night subject, represent a great fire, so that the object which is nearest to the fire may be tinged with its color, since the object which is nearest the fire will participate most in its nature. And as you will make the fire red, all the objects which it illumines must be red also, and those which are farther off from the fire will be dyed to a greater extent by the dark color of night. The figures which are between you and the fire appear dark from the obscurity of the night, not from the glow of the firelight, and those which are at the side are half dark and half ruddy, and those which are visible beyond the edge of the flames will be altogether lighted up by the red glow against a black background. As to their action, make those which are near shield themselves with their hands and cloaks against the intense heat, with averted faces as though about to flee. With regard to those who are farther off, represent them chiefly in the act of raising their hands to their eyes, dazzled by the intense glare. How to represent storm. If you wish to represent well a storm, consider and weigh its effects when the wind, blowing across the surface of the sea and the earth, removes and carries with it those things which are not stable in the universal drift. And in order to represent this storm adequately, you must in the first place represent tattered and rent clouds rushing with the rushing wind, accompanied by sandy dust caught up from the seashores, and boughs and leaves torn up by the force and fury of the wind, and dispersed in the air, with many other light objects. The trees and the plants bent towards the earth almost seem as though they wished to follow the rushing wind, with their boughs wrenched from their natural direction, and their foliage all disordered and distorted. Of the men who are to be seen, some are fallen and entangled in their clothes, and almost unrecognizable on account of the dust, and those who remain standing may be behind some tree, clutching hold of it so that the wind may not tear them away. Others, with their hands over their eyes, on account of the dust, stoop towards the ground, with their clothes and hair streaming to the wind. The sea should be rough and tempestuous, and full of swirling eddies and foam among the high waves, and the wind hurls the spray through the tumultuous air like a thick and swathing mist. As regards the ships that are there, you will depict some with torn sails and tattered shreds fluttering through the air with shattered rigging. Some of the masts will be split and fallen, and the ship lying down and wrecked in the raging waves. Some men will be shrieking and clinging to the remnants of the vessel. You will make the clouds driven by the fury of the winds and hurled against the high summits of the mountains, and eddying and torn like waves beaten against rocks. The air shall be terrible owing to deep darkness caused by the dust and the mist and the dense clouds. How to describe a battle. In the first place you must represent the smoke of the artillery mingled with the air, and the dust, and tossed up by the stampede of the horses and the combatants. And you must treat this confusion in this way. Dust being an earthly thing has weight, and although owing to its fineness it is easily lifted up and mingled with the air, it nevertheless falls readily to the earth again, and it is its finest part which rises highest. Therefore that part will be the least visible and will seem to be almost of the same color as the air. The higher the smoke, which is mingled with the dusty air, rises towards a certain height, the more it will seem like a dark cloud, and at the summit the smoke will be more visible than the dust. The smoke will assume a bluish color, and the dust will retain its color. This mixture of air, smoke, and dust will seem much brighter on the side whence the light proceeds than on the opposite side. The more densely the combatants are enveloped in this confusion, the less distinctly will their lights and shadows be visible. You must cast a glowing light on the countenances and the figures, the atmosphere, the musketeers, and those who are near them, and this light diminishes in proportion as the distance between it and its cause increases, and the figures which are between you and the light will appear dark against a bright background, and their legs will be less visible in proportion as they are nearer to the earth, because the dust there is coarsest and thickest. And if you depict horses galloping beyond the crowd, make little clouds of dust, distant one from the other in proportion to the strides made by the horses. And the cloud which is farthest away from the horse will be the least visible. It must be high, scattered, and thin, and the nearer clouds will be more conspicuous, smaller and denser. The air must be full of arrows falling in every direction, some flying upwards, some falling, some on a level plain, and smoke should trail after the flight of the cannon balls. The foremost figures should have their hair and eyebrows clotted with dust. Dust must be on every flat portion they offer capable of retaining it. The conquerors you should make as they charge, with their hair and the other light things appertaining to them streaming to the wind, their brows contracted and limbs thrust forward inversely. That is, if the right foot is thrust forward, the left arm must be thrust forward also. And if you portray a fallen man, you must show where he has slipped and been dragged through the blood-stained mud, and around in the wet earth you must show the imprint of the feet of men and the hoofs of horses that have passed there. You will also represent a horse dragging its dead master, and in the wake of the body its track, as it has been dragged along through the dust and the mud. You must make the vanquished and beaten pale, their brows knit, and skin surmounting the brow furrowed with lines of pain. On the sides of the nose there must be wrinkles forming an arch from the nostrils to the eyes, and terminating at the commencement of the latter. The nostrils should be drawn up, whence the wrinkles mentioned above. The arched lips show the upper row of teeth. The teeth should be apart, as with crying and lamentation. One hand shields the frightened eyes, the palm being held towards the enemy. The other hand rests on the ground to sustain the raised body. You shall portray others shouting in flight with their mouths wide open. You must depict many kinds of weapons lying at the feet of the combatants, such as broken shields, lances, shattered swords, and other similar objects. You must portray dead men, some half covered, some entirely covered, by the dust which is mingled with the spilt blood and converted into red mud, and the blood is seen by its color flowing in a sinuous stream from the body to the dust. Others in their death agony are grinding their teeth, rolling their eyes, and clenching their fists against their bodies and their distorted legs. Some might be represented disarmed and thrown by the enemy, turning upon him with teeth and nails to wreak cruel and sharp revenge. A riderless horse might be represented charging with his mane streaming to the wind amidst the enemy, and inflicting great damage with his hoofs. Some maimed man might be seen fallen to the earth and protecting himself with his shield, while the enemy, bending over him, tries to kill him. You might show a number of men fallen together over a dead horse. You would see some of the conquerors leaving the battle and issuing from the crowd, clearing with their hands their eyes and cheeks of the mud made by the watering of their dust-bespattered eyes. You would see the reserve standing full of hope and caution, with their brows alert, shading them with their hands, and gazing through the thick and confused darkness, attentive to the orders of their captain. And likewise the captain, with his staff raised, is rushing toward these reserves, and points out to them the spot where they are needed. And you may add a river, with horses charging into it, and stirring up the water all around them into seething waves of mixed foam and water, which is spurted into the air and among the legs and bodies of the horses. And there must not be a level place that is not trampled with gory steps. Envy. Envy offends with false infamy, that is to say, by detraction which frightens virtue. Envy must be represented with the hands raised to heaven in contempt, because if she could, she would use her power against God. Make her face covered with a goodly mark, show her as wounded in the eye by a palm branch, and wounded in the ear by laurel and myrtle, to signify that victory and truth offend her. Draw many thunderbolts proceeding from her as a symbol of her evil speaking. Make her lean and shriveled up, because she is continual dissolution. Make her heart gnawed by a swelling serpent. Make her a quiver full of tongues for arrows, because she often offends with these. Make her a leopard's skin, because the leopard kills the lion through envy and by deceit. Place a vase in her hand full of flowers, and let it be full also of scorpions, toads, and other reptiles. Let her ride death, because envy, which is undying, never wearies of sovereignty. Make her a bridle loaded with diverse arms, because her weapons are all deadly. As soon as virtue is born, it begets envy, which attacks it. And sooner will there exist a body without a shadow, than virtue unaccompanied by envy. Fame. Fame alone rises towards heaven, because God looks with favor on virtuous things. Infamy must be represented upside down, because its works are contrary to God, and move towards hell. Fame should be depicted covered with tongues instead of with feathers, and in the form of a bird. The expressive picture. A picture or a representation of human figures should be done in such a way that the spectator can easily recognize the purpose that is in their minds by their attitudes. If you have to represent a man of high character, let his gestures be such as harmonize with fair words. Likewise, if you have to represent a man of low character, let his gestures be fierce, let him thrust his arms towards the listener, and let his head and chest be thrust forward in front of his feet, following the hands of the speaker. It is thus with a dumb man, who seeing two speakers, although he is deprived of hearing, nevertheless, owing to the attitudes and gestures of the speakers, understands the subject of their argument. I once saw at Florence a man who had become deaf by an accident, who, if you spoke loud to him, did not understand you, but if you spoke gently, without making any noise, he understood you merely by the movements of the lips. Now you can say, does not one who talks loudly move his lips like the one who talks softly? In regard to this I leave experiment to decide. Make a man speak gently to you, and note his lips. The ages of man. How the ages of man should be depicted. That is, infancy, childhood, youth, manhood, old age, decrepitude. How old men should be depicted with lazy and slow movements, their legs bent at the knees when they stand still, and their feet placed parallel and apart, their backs bent, their heads leaning forward, and their arms only slightly extended. How women should be represented in modest attitudes, their legs close together, their arms folded together, their heads bent and inclined to one side. How old women should be represented with eager, vehement, and angry gestures, like the furies of Hades. The movement of the arms and the head should be more violent than that of the legs. Little children with ready and twisted movements when sitting, and when standing up in shy and timid attitudes. You will do as follows if you wish to represent a man talking to a number of people. You must consider the matter which he has to treat, and suit his action to the subject. That is to say, if the matter is persuasive, let his action be appropriate to it. If the matter is argumentative, let the speaker hold one finger of the left hand with 2 fingers of the right hand, closing the 2 smaller ones, and with his face turned towards the people and his mouth half open, let him seem to be about to speak. And if he is sitting, let him appear as though about to rise, with his head forward. If you represent him standing up, let him lean slightly forward, with his body and head towards the people. You must represent the people silent and attentive, looking at the orator's face, with gestures of admiration, and depict some old men with the corners of their mouths pulled down in astonishment at what they hear, their cheeks drawn in and full of lines, their eyebrows raised, and thus causing a number of wrinkles on the forehead. Again, some must be sitting with the fingers of their hands clasped and resting on their knee. Another, a bowed old man, with one knee crossed over the other, and on the knee let him hold his hand, and let his other elbow rest on his hand, and let the hand support his bearded chin. You must represent an angry man holding some one by the ear, beating his head against the ground, with one knee on his ribs, his right arm raising his fist in the air. His hair must be dishevelled, his eyebrows low and narrow, his teeth clenched, and the two corners of his mouth set, his neck swelled, and his brow wrinkled and bent forward as he leans over his enemy. The desperate man must hold a knife, and must have torn open his garments, and with one hand he must be tearing open the wound, and you must represent him with extended feet and the legs slightly bent, and his body leaning towards the earth, his hair flying and dishevelled. Notes on the Last Supper. One who was in the act of drinking leaves his glass in its place and turns his head towards the speaker. Another, twisting the fingers of his hands together, turns with stern brows to his companions. Another, with his hands spread out, shows their palms, and shrugs his shoulders towards his ears. His mouth expresses amazement. Another speaks in the ear of his neighbour, and he, as he listens to him, turns towards him, lending him his ear, while he holds a knife in one hand and a piece of bread in the other, half cut through by the knife. Another, in turning with a knife in his hand, has upset a glass on the table. Another lays his hands on the table and looks fixedly. Another puffs out his cheeks, his mouth full. Another leans forward to see the speaker, shading his eyes with his hand. Another draws back behind him, who is leaning forward, and sees the speaker between the wall and the man who is leaning forward. End of section 12.